I lived in Israel for a long time, and after leaving Israel, I went to Germany. My mother fled Germany in 1939, and so to go there was to go to hell. And we didn't even buy Mercedes or anything that was made in Germany. So this was a very big thing, but it was a wonderful experience, and I went to Dachau, but I was very young. So it always stayed in my mind that this was something I had to do. I think I was always writing these poems. I'd like to start with an epilogue, why I wrote this book. Because the Holocaust history continues to be distorted, I wrote this book. Because a 5-inch square of mesh, a jerry-rigged window, appears at the top of the cattle car for air. Because people, especially Holocaust perpetuators, are accountable for their crimes. Because countries looked away and still do. I wrote this book. Not to bury the dead, but to give an audience to their stories, what they cannot tell, lest we forget. Because my representation of their voices is rooted in fact, no matter how ugly. Because 1/3 of the people surveyed believe the Holocaust is a myth. Because Gerald Stern, Robert Pinsky, Edward Hirsch, Hannah Bloch, and many other poets behave like a Jew. Because Paul Celan and Primo Levi lived through the incarceration, wrote about it, then couldn't stand to live. Because my relatives' ashes still feed the fields in Auschwitz, but one survived to tell about it. Because gypsy children were slaughtered and forgotten, while Poles, homosexuals, the club-footed, the frayed, the deformed, the feeble, the blemished were butchered, gassed, burnt, their bones fed to the river. Because Rabbi Hillel said, "If I am not for myself, who is for me? And when I am for myself, who am I? And if not now, then when?" The first poem I'd like to read is about my mother. When she left Germany, my grandfather said, well, we should go to Portugal, and then decided that it was too difficult a language to speak, so they came to America. And this is called We Were Going Somewhere, 1939. I was on my knees and scuttled, if there's a word for what I did and how they saw me, what I seemed there on the floor of pine needles in autumn, where I almost fell into song. I so loved the taste of November, the month my mother, a pale redhead, afraid of fire and birds, emerged from her mother in a hospital on a tree-lined street in a country split in half, speaking a guttural tongue. By the time her family caught wind of conspiracy, of scapegoat, of yellow stars, "Hurry," she shouted at birth. As if time moved forward without history, and she and millions of others left the room, valises bound with rope, hands gloved against a cold wind at the dock, and the ship left with her, a taffeta gown, a chandelier, and glass teacups, sailing to some place and going somewhere. By the way, these photographs I took in Poland, most of them in Auschwitz, and this was taken at the Warsaw Ghetto, or what was left of the Warsaw Ghetto, on some of the buildings that are being resurrected and rehabilitated, and there were photographs of people who had died in the ghetto, and this is one of them. The season in which we carry all that we owned. Our men wore black coats to hide whatever they'd need inside. We packed the shoes good for walking, though we were going by train. A survivor remembers the arrival. Small fortunes neatly placed in rows. From where I stood, they looked like tender headstones. Then, later, ribbons tied to a pair of small shoes, small red shoes. Each of us brought a bundle, a valise, a satchel marked with name, street, and city. Goldstein, Sarah. Nadelman, Clara. While waiting in line, we asked one another, should we hold the bundle or let it go, travel lighter? There comes a time when mercy is not called for, this being the time to run, to pick up stones, something to wield, to hold on to wonder, have we not come to the wrong town, taken the wrong train? Shoes. There were tons, literally tons of shoes that were collected by the Germans initially, by the Nazis. Initially it was to send the leather back home to remake shoes for the soldiers and for the other Germans. And then after a while, there were just so many, they just kept stacking them up. This is dedicated to Doris Mathis, born June 14th, 1942, gassed January 17, 1944. 2 years old. Cork-soled, peep-toe, half boots, heavy flannel. First shoes nested where the train stopped. After it pulled thousands through. The scale of it cruel, ash gray, brick red, russet, black, bone, amber. But the tiny shoes from the smallest limbs at the last stop, dare take your little one, have her try them on, walk where they were taken, pocket-size ankle straps, buckles undone, mounds of leather booties, blue marguerite. Such shoes once stripped by winter, stripped of grace, long since buried in fields planted by grief. Now turn away from them, the shoes, their fate. Exactly like that. Exactly like that. In Auschwitz, it was if you were a musician of any sort, and there were many, you were lucky enough to be alive to play in the orchestra, and they had a few of them. They had a women's orchestra and a very well-known men's orchestra, and it was made up of professional musicians, mostly Jews, and they were, of course, forced to play foxtrots, ironically, marches, and these pieces of music were composed oftentimes in the camps, and they were used to have the laborers walk in and out of the camp so they could be recorded in number and kept in line and marched together. And then they were also, the orchestra played before execution. So it was more than irony. It was something really unbelievable, but they did play, and they played to live. Auschwitz, the orchestra. They dragged their bodies barefoot through shit. Shit to the waist, deep in wishes, deep in a tired thaw, waist deep in wishes, shit and the deep dragging in of ash, now silt, yet wishing to live on, these hearts cast out, cut stone. Has our starving God mistaken this stone for sustenance, given us the means for music, the which for everything else? Whose twisted theater, whose music, this sudden ictus, when the orchestra plays for time, while we tally such grotesqueries, the walking dead honoring nothing, into the song of what? One of the striking things about being at Birkenau, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Auschwitz was the death camp, and Birkenau was where the workers were, and it was like a two-part concentration camp. But one of the eerie things about being there was a sense of beauty in one small part of it, which I felt very guilty about sharing with myself. But there was this guardhouse, and next to it was this beautiful willow, and it seemed to me just too difficult to put these two things together, but there they were. And this is called Birkenau, a guard's confession. He hated how the willow next to the guardhouse rubbed itself, its wood. Hated their shoes, their gold teeth, their blue-eyed babies, the orchestra tapping out Mozart in striped pajamas. Hated how they balked at Judenrump, overflowing with shoes, fur coats and valises filled with oranges and soap. Hated the yelping dogs, the squadrons, the gates, the lineups, how they turned away from the chimney's exhaust. How on earth? The stench, the smoke, the ash. Hated the stockpiling of spectacles, hair, teeth. The traffic inside this busy oven where the blood went through. The iron pathway that brought them here. This is, the next piece is Interrogation Confession. A lot of the poems in this book were subtitled with confession, because to me, that's how I felt I could get through writing about this, as if it were a confession from me, using the voices of some of the survivors, some of the victims, and some of the perpetrators. And so this is Interrogation. I'm not a Jew who looks back at his failures and asks of himself what the long night asks of him. I'm not a Jew, no half gypsy, no low-down lover of other men or kinda, no rigged man of religion. Not for Christ's sakes the brother of a priest whose mother, left in the forsaken fields to fend for herself, lies down in those fields. And not the cousin who with dirty nails stands in a broad road holding 3 eggs staring straight at the sky into the future. No, I never hid a Jew, never touched the yellow star on his threadbare coat and called him mein Freund. And if I had, we never spoke of it, never whispered words that rang untrue or small. I'm not the slick-haired Yid with a purse filled with pfennigs, not a liar using guile to hide my yellow star. No, my backbone is perfectly carved, alabaster bone of my own conviction, not the dark curtain of your knowing. I'm the certainty of the answer when the long night asks, is this what became of sin? The next several poems are in the center of the book, and they are about the medical experiments that Joseph Mengele did, better known as the Angel of Death. And a lot of the children were quite fond of him, actually, because he would carry bonbons and chocolates in his pocket, and they were his special children. So as soon as the cattle cars stopped at the ramp, children and mothers and fathers came off, and Mengele stood there and picked out the twins. He had an obsession with twins, and he felt that by manipulating the genetic traits of the Jews, of the gypsies in particular, that he could form a super race. So these experiments and everything in this book is real. And this is the first poem, called A Medical Confession. The Instruments. Picture 2 sterile clamps on a background of linen, how they tie off the blood vessels at either end, mimicking a combat wound, as if you could have imagined this. Here are his dissecting scissors, curved or round, the needles, the polished blades, tubes, forceps, the small bone mallet, the pliers, scalpel, sutures, the disinfected knives suggesting mirrors, vials, vats, and gloves, tools of the trade. The dissecting room. Also remember that any and all of these experiments were done to further the success of German soldiers. So nothing, there was no anesthesia used at all. Not at all. The dissecting room. You must imagine a room bathed in light, whitewashed, well lit, sterile. One large window overlooks a birch grove. A concrete floor is red, the color of a heart. In the center of the room, a table of polished marble. Along its edges, several drains for the bleeding. Against the wall, 3 porcelain sinks and the second window above the table covered with a screen to keep out the flies. The doctor holds a small head in one hand, documents the darkness of the hair in the other, the distance between the brows, the caliper, the circumference of the head, and staring up at Mengele with dead gimlet eyes, the very blossom of mercy, this gypsy boy. Like a temple, this child like a temple. Pain management, surgery without anesthesia. This is for Tibi and Moshe Ofer. And Moshe Ofer is still alive, but his identical twin Tibi is not. And this is Moshe speaking. Once his spine had been snapped, he was carried back to me, unable to walk. In the morning, Mengele returned to open him up. His liver punctured, removed. Other organs, tucked beneath organs, rearranged. Infected ones, gangrened, buried themselves in the maze of his belly. Cat gut ligatures sewed up by Mengele closed my brother's open heart. Mine was beating in the next room. My brother of tissue and bone, welts and open wounds slit, lacerated, hacked, then gutted until hollow. Dark puddles of blood pooled beneath a table. Some spilled from vials on the sill where the fog light came in. Numbered among Mengele's sins, my twin, Tibi. This is number 4 in the medical confession called Genetics. And this is for Guido and Nino, identical gypsy twins, age 4. I just want to mention that in this particular story, it's a true story, many of the mothers would be called to be with their children because they were crying so much. And in order to continue with these experiments, the children had to be quiet. So mothers were called in. In this particular unimaginable experience, the children were so distraught and screaming that the mother was called in, the gypsy mother was called in. And while Mengele was off doing something, the mother was able to get a needle and injected her children so that they wouldn't have to bear the pain anymore, and she had to kill them. And you'll understand why from this poem. Should we sew them up as one, back to back, wrist to wrist, the gypsy twins, or let them go, hollering in one voice, cold, into the oven? Should we study their likeness, flush as petals, dressed in matching clothes, pockets filled with bonbons, or draw a distinction between the two, inject the methylene to make one's black eyes blue, then settle the second one in with a sweet smell of liquid and chloroform his beating heart. I think the only way that I could have written any of these pieces was to write in either an irony or in such a straight, understated way, because there's no way that anyone could communicate any of these stories and these facts without making them so grand and losing the humanity of it. So it was very important for me to manage my emotion and to really bring across things as lyrical as I could, however, with all fact. And this is part 5, hypothermia, cold exposure and rewarming. And Mengele wanted to know how long it would take the German soldiers to defrost while they were in Russia. How long would it take them to warm up? So they did experiments on Russians, on Polish prisoners, on anyone they could find, and put them in freezing, kept them outside undressed in the freezing cold, and then would put them in hot vats under sun lamps to try to create this ersatz environment. The body prepares itself for winter. A long view of the grieving brain indicates a cluster of crooked blossoms, waxy from a mock winter in which the Jew froze. The first chimes of hypothermia purpled the medulla and stripped him of breath. How long did it take the body to warm? And what killed him after freezing in a bath of snow? Was he thawed too quickly? Was it the glycerin injected through the afternoon hours? Or was it his arms and neck ticked with shots of lead that shut him down? Was it the boiling tub meant to warm him, or the heat from the borrowed light of a dozen sun lamps, crisping his skin? Oh, surely it was the shock of the woman brought in to fuck the frozen Jew hour after hour in the hopes of warming him up. How long did that take? And how was it that her body, flanked by frozen flesh, stayed warm as she attached herself like an embrace to the cold armor of his belly, hoping to save one of them? This was for Mark and Francesca Berkowitz, and actually they both lived. There were some good stories. Bone jar, the oven, an elegy. In the oven's arms, finger bones, distal, proximal. On the highest flame, a child's velvet nape, the satiny, small-boned vault of a nail bed, skin's fingerprint melting. Here's to the dirge of backbones, simmering in concert with the femurs, those longest of bones efficiently arranged. Here are the ribs, all 24 caged in the bony thoracic, and there are the two floating, untethered from the sternum, like starlings coming suddenly loose, letting it last go, as though the structure of the world, encouraged to burn itself, gave in to resilience forever. And remember the stirrup bone, the stapes, most small of all, taking in the crack and split, which could be heard as heartbreak. or it's the clavicle that once cinched a throat, or a scapula. And there's the din of the slow giving in of wishbones, millions deep. The last poem I'd like to read, and I just want to thank you so much for being here. This may not be an easy reading to listen to, but it's most important that we keep this alive in terms of the story. And I think we don't want to make it anybody else's story, but unfortunately it continues. And we have to write about it, and we have to paint about it, and we have to use our art to keep communicating. This is the last poem, and it's called Someone You Know, and it's in a glossiform, which is 4 stanzas, and it uses 4 lines of a poem by Paul Celan from the poem The Lonely One. More than the dove, more than the mulberry, it's me that autumn loves, gives me a veil. Take this for dreaming, says its stitchery, and God's as nearby as the vulture's nail. Not the snow, the frost, veil over mouth, not the dust, not the barracks and moonlight, not the wind, the smoke, the ash on the sill. Someone you know? Not the light-headed women at the window listening in their heads. Waiting for what? For the angels to arrive in a hurry. For the garments you wore in a world you once knew. A table with candle flame and opus in a half-lit room. Your grand piano, your husband and child, such beauty. More than the dove, more than the mulberry. He is the field, the flood, the law breaking itself. He is the small sack of salt, the deluge confined to no peril, the foot of Moses on the temple door. He is the God after all. He is the God. See for yourself how the world turns and the news comes by cattle car, by helmets and crossbelts and boots. Inhale beyond what is carried off. We are ankle deep in it, digging our graves, burying our bones where his hand begins. Cover us, the still living. Hear our wail. It's me that autumn loves, gives me a veil. Let me look to the icy blackness, through the evenings dark by this window of lingering windows. To be somewhere other than where I am, which is no country at all, that I might sleep, a painless sleep in a district drunk with stars, ungovernable on the outskirts of a far-flung township whose waving flag remains in the shadows of this remote humility. Take my panicked feet married to the barrack floor, centuries of being summoned to a transitory patch of land. Deliver us a fragmentary scroll. Mend our deficiency. Take this for dreaming, says its stitchery. Among the signs which spell disaster, our family, dismantled, in lines to the left or the right. Among the exiles at your back, a million shoes off the feet of children. Mothers tilting their heads toward the world, which is no longer the world. For you, the earth of cloistered exits is a temple. Our shoes in piles, our tomb unveiled. Appear somehow among the waste facing the world's secret injuries. As if we mattered, dress us in cast-off overcoats that we may leave this life behind, though this is no life, and show yourself to some avail, as God's as nearby as the vulture's nail. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.